Hello, greetings. Thank you for your interest in spiritual matters, and thank you for giving us the gift of spending time today as we continue to explore what God has made known in Christ and in Scripture. My name is Ethan, and I work with the Venice Church of Christ in Los Angeles, California, and we want to be of service to you. If you have any questions or comments about our conversation today, please join us in our discussion with your comments. Please reach out to us at VeniceChurchOfChrist.org or also on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, or Twitter. Today, let us consider the character of Jacob. In the book of Genesis, Jacob is the most fleshed out character. We could spend many times and messages talking about the various episodes in Jacob's life. And it's good for us to explain and see, what does the Genesis author tell us about Jacob's character? Why is Jacob the one who is so fully developed and perhaps not Abraham or Isaac or others? And what does that mean perhaps for us in our faith as we look back to Jacob, the ancestor of all the Israelites? In order to do this, we're going to look into Jacob's life at various episodes. And we're going to begin at the time where we think he is around 70 years old, in Genesis chapter 28. A very pivotal moment in Jacob's life. We can understand about when Jacob lives based upon his fathers Abraham and Isaac and also some of the events of the Exodus. We can talk in greater detail, but we're going to act as if Jacob is living around the time of the 1900s BC. And Jacob, we said here, is around 70 years old already. And he has spent those 70 years living in the household with his father, mother, and older brother Esau. Esau is only a little older than he is because he had held on to Esau's heel when he was coming out of the womb. And thus, that's one way we can understand Jacob's name. The other way we can understand Jacob's name is about cheating. And of course, he was able to get the birthright from his brother because of the pot of stew he sold him. And he also received the blessings that his brother should have received through this subterfuge that he went in and pretended to be Esau before his father Isaac. And we often will chastise Jacob for doing such things in such ways. But it had been prophesied that the elder would serve the younger. How much that featured into how the parents treated the children is not known. We also can see that Isaac had preference for Esau, and that was problematic in and of itself, and also problematic was that Rebekah favored Jacob. Esau was a hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was more reserved and a man who'd stay around the tents. And that's also going to go a long way to describe what's going on here. Esau feels like he's been cheated, and Esau is waiting for his father to die so that he can take vengeance on his brother and kill him. And Rebekah is made aware of this, and so Jacob is now sent away, sent to go live with Rebekah's brother Laban up in Padan Aram, up in northern Mesopotamia, where Rebekah and Abraham and Sarah had come from. So in this moment, Jacob is now alone. He is heading away from his family, heading away from everything he's ever known. And when he is here at a place that is called Luz, but will be known as Bethel, he's sleeping. And he receives a vision from God of angels ascending and descending a ladder. And God comes to him and speaks to him and says that he is going to watch over Jacob. He is going to be Jacob's God. He is going to provide the promises to Jacob that he had given to Abraham and to Isaac. And thus Jacob is now identified as the one who is receiving this great promise from faith of Abraham and Isaac. And Jacob recognizes this is the place of God. That's why he calls it Bethel, house of God. And he makes a vow here that if God does what he says he's going to do, that if he comes back to the land and has goods and is in good condition, he will make an altar to God, he will make God his God, and he will tithe things he is given. So we can see his mentality this time and the kind of interesting vow and almost challenge to God that he makes here, and that he still has this kind of ambivalent relationship with God. God is not yet his own God. We're now going to go into the future, 20 years, and go into Genesis chapter 31. By the time of Genesis 31, so 20 years has passed. And now Jacob is more than just one person. He has married Leah and Rachel, who have given him their handmaidens as well. He has 11 sons and a daughter, and has come into many flocks and herds. And there's a lot we can say about Jacob and his marriages, his preferential treatment of Rachel, his preferential treatment of Joseph, but it's worth pointing out that in all of this, Jacob is not really the one at fault. That it's Laban who is the one who is at fault. That Jacob loved Rachel, but Laban first gave him Leah, and that was on Laban. That Jacob had nothing to do with that. And that was in fact the way Laban cheated Jacob out of 7 years of labor, working for somebody he had not intended to work for. He had to work another 7 years for Rachel, and he'd worked another set of 7 years here in this time period to continue to grow his flocks and herds and to bless and benefit Laban. And Jacob has brought Leah and Rachel out to a field to have a conversation about what's been going on. And he tells them that the attitude of their father toward him has changed. But the God of my father has been with me, Jacob says. I've worked for your father as hard as I could, but your father has humiliated me and changed my wages 10 times. But God has not allowed him to do any harm to me. And God had shown up to Jacob in a dream and told him, take your family and go back to your land. Go back to where you came from. And so he spoke this to his wives. What's interesting is what Leah and Rachel respond with. They say, do we still have any portion or inheritance in our father's house? Hasn't he treated us like foreigners? He not only has sold us, but completely wasted the money paid for us. And so somehow Laban had wasted all the resources he had gained from Jacob's labor for all those 14 years. And thus they are also willing and saying, God has snatched away the wealth from our father and that belongs to us and our children, and so they would go with him. And so we can see that Jacob has been humbled over these 20 years. He was the one who had cheated. Now he had experienced that on the other side. He was the one who did not have the power and suffered because of that, under the duplicitous and exploitative ways of his uncle turned father-in-law, Laban, and suffered such things and had learned from them. We're going to go forward now in time, which actually isn't a terribly long amount of time, but very significant in terms of what Jacob had experienced. When we get to the end of Genesis chapter 33, we see that Jacob has gone through a lot in a very short time. After he began to flee, he had to confront his father-in-law, who had followed after him and was able to stand up against his father-in-law. And the best his father-in-law could do at that moment to save face was to simply make peace. He then prepared to meet his brother Esau, who he last had heard was trying to kill him. And when he heard that Esau was coming with thousands of men, it did not sound very promising. And so he was preparing his family and his flocks for that. And in the midst of all of this, we're told in Genesis 32, he wrestles with a man until daybreak. And we have a lot of questions about that. How is Jacob at 90 years old wrestling anybody? Is this a common thing? Do you just randomly run into people and start wrestling with them? What's going on here? None of that is explained. But what is explained is that Jacob wrestles this man to a tie. He wants a blessing. He is given the name Yisrael, which means wrestles with God. And when he asks to know who he's wrestling with, they find out the name is wonderful. He calls the place Peniel because he believes he has seen the face of God there. He has been wrestling with a divine being. And then he crosses over. He meets Esau, and it's all well. And so he's able to fulfill his purposes. He returns to the land. And we're told in Genesis 33 that he buys a plot of land from Shechem, there in the land of Shechem, and for 100 pieces of money. And there he set up an altar and called it El Elohe Yisrael, which means the God of Israel is God. And this is a very powerful, poignant thing, because if we notice beforehand, Jacob has spoken of God as the God of his fathers, the fear of his father Isaac. There's always been that level of remove with God. But now, God is the God of Israel. The God of Israel is God. That he has now owned God as his own because he has wrestled with God. Jacob's wrestling was very physical in one way, but also in a very compelling way about everything he had gone through. God had proven faithful, right? God had watched over him. God took care of him when he was in Padan Aram. Only reason he had anything was because God was watching over him, and he put his trust in God, and he wrestled with that heritage he had been given. And now the God of Israel is God. The final moment we're going to look into is when he stands before Pharaoh. About 40 years later. He's 130 years old at this point. And this is in Genesis chapter 47. Now, in these 40 years, you might think he's been mostly in the land of his fathers, the land where his fathers had been sojourning, and things might be well. But we must remember that his wife Rachel had died not terribly long after he had gotten there. And then, at the age of 17, his son Joseph, as far as Jacob knew, had died. And it's only 22 years later now that he is learning, no, Joseph was not dead. Joseph was alive and in Egypt. And maybe by this point he's heard that what his children had told him 22 years ago was not exactly the truth. And they knew it wasn't the truth. And maybe he's already grappled with that, or maybe not. But at this point now, he is no longer in the land of his fathers. He's now in Egypt, and he's standing before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh asks him how long he's lived. And Jacob says, "All the years of my travels are 130. All the years of my life have been few and painful. The years of my travels are not as long as those of my ancestors." So he looks at this as a sojourn, as travels. He's, yes, been maybe in Shechem for the better part of 40 years. But that was only one phase of his life. And at other times he had been moving around and did not have much land. Yes, he bought a little plot of land for himself, but then he had to deal with his neighbors, and then he was now in Egypt, and he would never come home until his bones are brought back. And they've been few and painful years. He had gone through a lot of pain and a lot of distress. And he had reached this point. Now, in the future, he's going to provide blessings for Joseph's sons Manasseh and Ephraim. They'll be elevated to the same level as Jacob's own sons, and he's going to have the younger be greater than the older, Ephraim over Manasseh. He's going to provide messages to all the sons about what will happen. He will die, and his bones will be taken up and buried in the cave of Machpelah with Abraham and Sarah, with Isaac and Rebekah, and with Leah, his wife. And that's the story of Jacob. So why is Jacob so developed in this narrative? Well, Jacob is Israel, right? He is Yisrael. He is the one who becomes what we call the eponymous ancestor of Israel. The people of God will not call themselves Abrahamites or Isaacites. They call themselves Israelites because of Jacob. And in the book of Genesis, we look at the book of Genesis and see it in terms of these individual personalities. But the ancients rightly saw that it wasn't just about these individuals. These individuals were going to set the tone for the nations that would come in their name. So when we see the story of Jacob, we're supposed to see the story of Israel. And we can see many parallels. Jacob was not the first person to come around, was he? He is the grandson of Abraham, and he's really the second-born grandson of Abraham. According to primogeniture, he should not receive anything. He only has what he has, and his standing only is there because of God. And that's also the story of Israel, his descendants. They're not the first people around. The Bible makes that very clear, right? They're not a coherent people until the late Bronze Age. In the early time periods, you know, the locus of everything going on is in Mesopotamia or in Egypt. It's not in the land of Israel. And the Israelites come very late to the scene. Yet they exist because God has called them and blessed them. Jacob goes through trials, has his moments of distress, learns through the sufferings he goes through, and recognizes that God strengthens and sustains him through it, and has to go through all these travels and learn from these things. And Israel's the same way. They had to learn through the sojourning in Egypt, and the exodus, and the wilderness, and the conquest, to put their trust in God. Even when they were in the land, they still suffered all kinds of difficulties and challenges, a lot of times because of their sin, but also just because of the situation around them. And they would have to go through a period of exile, and yet had the promised restoration, and of course the fullness of that restoration would come in Jesus. And so when Israel saw the story of their ancestors, they saw their own story, they saw their own lives. But such an interesting name, isn't Israel? Wrestles with God. Such a weird name for a people. But yet it's a very compelling one. Because as we've seen, Jacob had to wrestle with God. Not just with the angel there on that one very interesting night, but also just in general to make the God of his fathers his own God. And that's supposed to set the tone for the rest of the story. And in fact, the rest of the story of Israel can be seen as a story of the people of God wrestling with their God, and the promises he's made, the challenges in which they find themselves, and how that works together. And you can see that very compellingly in Psalms 44 and 88 and 89, where there are declarations and laments being made there that we would blanch at and we would feel would be impious if we tried to make them. Now in Galatians 6 and verse 16, with his own hand, Paul writes to the Galatians that peace be upon the Israel of God. And he's not referring to Israel according to the flesh. That with this and many other evocations and hints in the New Testament, we are to see that God has now centered Israel around his son Jesus. And that we who are in Christ are the spiritual Israel. And thus we are also those who wrestle with God. And we have received the deposit of faith from our ancestors. We have learned about the God of our fathers, and we will have to go through our own wrestling, our own striving, our own work, in order that we can make the God of our fathers our God. And what's that going to look like? It's going to look like something like Jacob's life, where we are sojourners. It might be a bitter sojourn. There's going to be a lot of lessons that we learn through suffering and distress, and we can look back and see few and evil the days of our lives. Very much the way Jacob is able to. But we can also be preserved by the same kind of faith that Jacob had. That Jacob had put his trust in the God of his fathers, and that God had seen him through. It didn't mean that what Jacob had to endure was easy, but it meant that he was able to endure it. And that is God's sustaining promise for all of those who follow and serve the God of Israel. That we will be strengthened and sustained by him through whatever we shall endure, and then we shall receive the promise, we shall receive the inheritance in the resurrection of life. It is for good reason we must remember that when God revealed himself to Moses, he was as much the God of Jacob as he was the God of Abraham and Isaac. And that is why it's good for us to look to Jacob and his example, and to put our trust in the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And to have the confidence that he will strengthen and sustain us till we must endure, and that through him we can receive the resurrection of life. We're so glad that you've joined us. Please reach out to us if we can be of any service, and may the Lord bless and keep you until we're able to meet again.